glad you're safe in Tel Aviv right now. We appreciate you taking the time tonight to join us on this. Just give us an idea of what you witnessed today.
Sure. Thank you. Yes, so actually about 2.5 hours ago, Iran launched a missile attack on Israel, and since the beginning of this attack, the IDF says that they have identified approximately 180 missiles that were fired towards Israeli territory from Iran. These are ballistic missiles. And we can also tell you that an Israeli security official has told us that in cooperation with U.S. Air Force's Central, the Israeli Air Force operated in what they say is an effective and precise manner, and they have intercepted most of the missiles. Now, there were several hits that were identified in central and south Israel, and the damage is still being assessed. But we do know from emergency services here that there are 3 casualties that were very either lightly injured or treated for very minor injuries.
So are people out? My understanding is that the message did go out that they didn't anticipate any more missiles, although as we've been reporting, Iran seems to be saying that there could be more coming if Israel responded. What is the guidance you are hearing?
Yes. So about an hour and a half ago, at around 8:30 p.m. local time, the IDF announced that at this stage, once again, this was an hour and a half ago, they do not identify any additional aerial threats from Iran. So people were allowed to leave shelters and protected spaces. It's worth mentioning that as opposed to April, when Iran first attacked Israel by missiles and drones from its territory, this time it was a wider attack, not necessarily in the numbers of the missiles that were launched, but in the sense that this time they were aimed towards multiple targets in Israel. So it sent millions of people, in essence the entire country, into bomb shelters. There were 4 different rounds of sirens that were sounded, that were echoing throughout the entire country of Israel, and that is rare, I think unprecedented, at least in recent years, or I would even say in decades.
Hey, Galit, help us understand day-to-day life there right now and the way that Israelis are going about their typical day, but also dealing with the continued threat. So, as you're well aware, we're now marking, next week we're going to mark the year since the October 7th attacks that launched, kicked off the war in Gaza, and the fire exchanges with Lebanon that have escalated tremendously over the last several weeks. So I would say that the answer to that is, it comes and goes. I mean, in the border adjacent areas in the north and in the south, it's been more difficult, especially in the north. In the south, after the October 7th attacks, most of the settlements that were attacked were evacuated. So people have been relocated to other places in Israel that were safer and quieter. In the north, the fire exchanges have kept on going, which also resulted in a lot of evacuation. So there are tens of thousands of people who've been displaced in Israel for the past year, and that has been quite difficult, obviously, for them. And also from a national perspective, and I would also say from an economic perspective, with the government having to fund the evacuations and so forth. In central Israel, in Tel Aviv and the surrounding areas, much of the time, routine has been kept, life, has been going on, given the overall atmosphere of war in various regions of the country. So it really depends on where you would look and where you would go. It varies from place to place.
All right, gonna leave it on that note. Galit, thank you so much, and certainly stay safe. Galit Alstein from Tel Aviv. She is Bloomberg News economy and government reporter with an update on the situation there in Israel.
Well, let's go to another part of the world, to Beijing right now.
Usually he joins us to talk about China, and we'll certainly get to that. He also joins us to talk about India. We'll get to that as well. We've got with us Ben Harburg, founder and portfolio manager at Core Values Alpha. He joins us from Beijing. Ben, we'd be remiss if we didn't start with the situation that continues to evolve in the Middle East. Help us understand how you think what's going on in Israel, in Iran, will affect the economies of that area of the world.
We spend about half our time based in Abu Dhabi, so this has been an ongoing issue for us. It has been largely contained to date. In fact, we were actually surprised by how little contagion was felt across the GCC as a result of escalating tensions dating back to last October, with many of our global investors rarely even asking us if it had anything to do or any impact on our portfolio. And it just because it just feels like two separate worlds, kind of the Levant and Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, relative to this kind of more stability of the GCC, particularly the UAE and Saudi Arabia. But obviously what's happened over just the last few hours is going to test that theory significantly. So TBD, but certainly historically contained and now potentially a significant impact.
The GCC, of course, being the Gulf Cooperation Council, and so we're talking about politically and economically the alliance of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, and Oman. So just for those who might be listening. So I do think about the way forward. It's been a region, an area with much conflict. And when we think about the Middle East, right, not every element of it, every country is the same. So I just do wonder as, I don't know, I think about the Bloomberg audience trying to understand their way forward and what impact this will have on them. How are you thinking about it?
Well, again, the economies certainly are not that interrelated, and particularly places like Saudi Arabia, we've spent a lot more of our time spend their whole day buffering themselves against Iran. Obviously, trade had begun to flourish, particularly with the UAE and Israel after the signing of the Abrahamic Accords, and obviously we were looking like normalization of relations with between Saudi Arabia and Israel was just around the corner. That's obviously been shelved. So it certainly is going to hurt regional cohesion indefinitely. And I think there's the fear is that there's some spillover. We had actually Houthi rocket attacks that hit Abu Dhabi very quietly a year and a half ago or so. And so there's kind of that fear that a stray rocket might find its way towards one of these stable markets like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and that could really start to spook people. But historically, again, it just feels like two separate planets, even though in true proximity, it's not that far.
But safe to say that, and to be fair, about a year ago when we started talking about, or obviously the Hamas attack against Israel specifically, we had a lot of conversations about how many attacks there are around the world within the Middle Eastern region, or by proxies of various Middle Eastern counterparts. But this feels like something different. Am I right in saying that, or no?
Even within the kind of Arabian Peninsula, there's been instability, and over the last years, particularly emanating out of Yemen. In the GCC, we were impacted, for instance, by the blockades on the Red Sea side. And so it's a funny part of the world that's kind of able to absorb blows and keep moving. Again, perhaps particularly the kind of northern, more stable markets in the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, et cetera. So it's somehow against all odds kind of keeps on chugging. And to some degree benefits if oil prices spike from that, particularly the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar. But overall, I mean, this is a new escalation, and just certainly there are a lot of relatives of folks that are sitting in Palestine, that are sitting in Beirut and elsewhere. So you're feeling it day to day, but the economic impact had not been felt. We'll see how the markets react now to this change.
We talk about stability, right? When we talk about geopolitics, I want to go to China, which is something we talk to you a lot about. And it does feel like over the last week or so, a couple of weeks, where every day or several days, the most read story on the Bloomberg terminal would be about some new leg of Chinese stimulus to help get out of the real estate malaise, to prop up the financial markets, the equity markets in particular. When it comes to China, does it feel more stable at this point?
Stability was never really the fear we had. It was convincing global investors of the Chinese government's secular intent to grow the economy and to fix what was ailing it, and to kind of assuage a lot of the fears that global investors had. Because we're all sitting looking at the market kind of just beside ourselves on the fundamentals. You have companies that are growing double digit, valued at 1x, or at single-digit PE relative to their U.S. peers who might be trading at 30 or 40%. You've got companies valued with the kind of the cash that's sitting on their balance sheet, and just fundamentally none of this made sense. But it really came down to trust and global investors feeling that they couldn't put money in China and that the U.S. was in any way outperforming it just because of that trust being broken. This raft of stimulus that we really, even those of us sitting on the ground in Beijing, didn't anticipate this scale and this kind of continued momentum, has really changed that narrative. And it's created a virtuous cycle where individual and retail investors in China who have been sitting on the sidelines with 31 or 21 trillion dollars of household savings are finally starting to emerge from their caves because they're seeing their equity values improving finally.
Hey, Ben, we have 2 minutes left, and I want to give you some time to talk about India because you guys are pretty bearish on India. Help us understand why that is.
I'm not a casual observer in India. I lived in India before. I did business with India, including many of the folks that are now leading the economy, the Reliances, the Adanis of the market. I think it's a market that has obviously seen huge interest over the last couple of years, particularly owing to capital flight out of China and an interest in finding kind of a market that is democratic, is more Western aligned. And so it kind of has been an easy a narrative to go to. But the reality is when you really spend time there and you really dip beneath the surface, you find one that is hugely and overly bureaucratic, where the government often gets in the way of private business, one that's often constrained by what I would kind of label crony capitalism, one that has had just a pockmarked history, particularly in recent years, of financial scandal at the highest levels. I mean, if you had a scandal on par with Gautam Adani's recent financial scandals in China with Pony Ma, the kind of richest man equivalent, it would be screaming headlines around the world. And India got a bit of a pass on that front. And from a technology perspective, we're venture investors. 2 of the top 3 biggest venture-backed companies that are still private today in India had huge demises, that being Oyo, kind of their hotels tonight, Airbnb equivalent, and a company called Byju's. So it's been just kind of a raft of challenges.
Well, listen, we went around the world, and we so appreciate it, and we know it's the middle of the night for you. So once again, thank you. Ben Harburg, he's founder and portfolio manager at Core Values Alpha, joining us once again from Beijing on this very, very busy Tuesday, October 1st, first day of the 4th quarter. And again, watching concerns out of the Middle East.
Coming up next, we're talking EVs. It's Bloomberg Plugged In, your weekly look at EVs.
3:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Investors are retreating to safer corners of the market with the conflict in the Middle East escalating. It has been a day of fast-moving developments in the Mideast as Iran fires missiles at Israel. The Israel Defense Forces says some 180 missiles have been fired in an Iranian attack on Israel. Israel says the Iranian missiles were mostly intercepted. Haven assets bid up with bonds, oil, gold, and the dollar all advancing after that missile barrage today. Right now, we have got the price of oil gaining. West Texas Intermediate crude up 3%, $70.25 a barrel. Brent, the global benchmark, up by 3%, $73.87 a barrel. Crude oil is retreating from session highs. We've got the S&P down 37 right now, down 0.7%. The Dow down 66, a decline of 0.1%. The Nasdaq Composite Index down 1.2%, lower by 220 points. 10-year yield right now, 3.74%. The 2-year, 3.61. Again, gold up 1.1%, $26.63 a barrel, and crude, worth repeating, higher now by 3%. Job openings rose in August to a 3-month high, a development at odds with other data indicating slowing demand for workers. So what about the Federal Reserve and the outlook for more jumbo cuts? Abby Yoder is equity strategist at JP Morgan Private Bank.
Our base case is that they go 25 basis points. I would say that, again, the job openings data that we just got this morning adds a little bit to that story. The fact that jobless claims are back to lows not seen since last May also adds that. And then the prices paid in the ISM this morning coming in below expectations. It seems like inflation is under control, but the labor market remains solid.
Abby Yoder of JP Morgan Private Bank. By the way, she raised her target on the S&P 500 from 5750 to 5925 by June of next year. The S&P right now at 5722. After the bell, we will be hearing from Nike on a down day for U.S. stocks. Nike ahead of earnings, up now by 1%. For on-demand news, 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Carol Master along with Tim Stanovic live here on Bloomberg Business Week. We're checking out our live blog regarding the launch, Iran launching ballistic missiles at Israel. I think we're now about 3 hours ago, and the U.S. vowing, of course, to defend. We did just wrap up a White House press briefing, but we also did hear also from a very senior Iranian official.
Yeah, President Masoud Pezeshkian, the most senior Iranian official to comment on the missile strike, has a warning to Benjamin Netanyahu, quote, "Know that Iran is not a warmonger, but will firmly stand against any threat." He wrote this on X. He also said the barrage was just a glimpse of our capabilities. Probably a note, as our live blog points out, that's aimed at Iranians, not the Israeli government or the U.S., given that the strike did not deliver beyond the limited damage achieved with April's volley.
All right, we've also heard, of course, the U.S. support for Israel. Let's get to our Bloomberg News U.S. National Security Team Leader, Nick Wadhams. He is joining us from Washington, D.C. Nick, give us an idea of what you are hearing and what's going on behind the scenes right now when it comes to U.S. officials on this and what their coordination might be and continue to be with Israel.
Sure. So far, we are hearing from the Defense Department that the U.S. involvement was that the U.S. has 2 destroyers in the region, 2 naval destroyers, and they shot down they launched about 12 interceptors. So if the assessment is there were about 200 missiles that came from Iran, the U.S. says its forces shot down about 12 of them. At the moment, they are assessing the damage to Israel appears to have been minimal. And then they're also saying they're talking to Israel very closely about what the next steps are. So, you have a bit of a contradiction where for some time, the U.S. has said that Israel has the right to defend itself and its actions in Lebanon against Hezbollah were necessary as part of that. But they're also saying now that the Iranian attack was escalatory and Iran should expect a response from Israel. And the question is what's going to happen, and the U.S. and Israel are discussing what to do next.
So I want to hone in on that point. The U.S. and Israel are discussing what's going to happen next. To what extent do we know that the U.S. and Israel coordinate on this type of action, or is this the type of thing that Israel would do without consulting the U.S.?
So, I mean, I think when it comes to Iran, That's something that we would expect. Generally, there would be a fair amount of coordination, though Israel has shown over the course of the conflict since October 7th that it sometimes does not tip off the U.S. or warn the U.S. about its actions or even goes against U.S. wishes. A big one there, obviously, was the attacks on Hezbollah and the decision to target Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah. The U.S. had been publicly urging Israel not to go ahead with attacks that would be seen as escalatory. But Israel obviously decided to go ahead and do so. You know, Iran is a little bit of a different kettle of fish because there's a sense that it doesn't pose as direct a threat to Israel the way that Hezbollah did, those rockets along the Lebanese border, and Hamas obviously with its attack. Now, both of those groups are obviously funded by Iran, so Israel says, you know, there really should not be any distinction between the two, but you can expect to see a lot of U.S. pressure on Israel not to conduct the sort of attack that would provoke an even greater Iranian response that then could trigger those fears of, you know, a much wider war in the region.
All right, Nick, so more U.S. pressure, perhaps. What about more U.S. military presence and troops in the region?
Well, we know the U.S. has extended the deployment of an aircraft carrier strike group in the region that was supposed to come home. That's going to be staying a little longer. Yesterday, the Pentagon said they had deployed a few thousand more forces, sort of mostly associated with fighter jet squadrons that are staying in the region. And they've also deployed some forces to assist if U.S. citizens should need to be evacuated from Lebanon. But other than that, at the moment, you know, they're not even telling U.S. Citizens to evacuate Lebanon. They have said, you know, if you can, it might be wise to get out on a commercial flight, but they're not ordering or seeking. I mean, they can't really order civilians to leave, but they're not telling people to get out as quickly as possible. So there is a sense, at least on the Lebanon side, that the U.S. believes that is not going to spread into the bigger sort of conflict we saw in 2006.
Nick, in your view, what is the role of the U.S. right now, and what would be a tipping point for you to then come on air and say the U.S. is now involved in a regional conflict in the Middle East, if it's not already?
Well, I mean, I think the tipping point would be an attack that targeted and wounded U.S. troops in a significant way, or an attack on Israel that really incurred a heavy amount of civilian casualties. I mean, right now the U.S. is trying to do this dual thing of sort of deterrence through shows of force, so sending more assets, more military assets to the region to say essentially, hey, Israel, we have your back. Hey, Iran, others, if you attack Israel, the response will be punishing. Challenge is if they do that, then the U.S. would have to deliver on its word, and that would then further escalate things and draw the U.S. into the war. So it's sort of it's a risky strategy of deterrence through a show of strength, and also trying to exert a moderating influence on Israel. So in the Iranian attack in April, we knew that the U.S. really helped shape and moderate the Israeli response to that. They just conducted a very, very limited strike. So obviously we'll have to wait and see, but the U.S. is being very open right now, at least, that they are in talks with Israel and discussing what comes next.
We're talking with Bloomberg News U.S. National Security Team Leader Nick Wadhams with us from D.C. Hey, Nick, you know, it's interesting. I was thinking about, you know, we all just kind of obviously perked up in the newsroom when that initial headline about the U.S. warning of an expected attack or a likely attack, if you will, from Iran into Israel. I go back to the Ukrainian war, how the U.S. really seemed to be leading in terms of warning, using their intelligence in terms of what, at the time, Russian President Vladimir Putin was expected to do, which all of this has panned out. Just what that says on a global, like, kind of the visual of that, if you will, of the role of the U.S. in terms of their security, their information, in terms of policing the world in some ways.
Well, I mean, I think what you see is, you know, the U.S. obviously has intelligence and surveillance capabilities that are essentially unsurpassed, unmatched by anyone else, though In the case of Ukraine, it was pretty obvious. I mean, they were seeing forces, tanks, trucks, massing on the border with Ukraine, and it really there was a very obvious indication there that this attack was coming. But it does reflect something you've seen that is much different from the Biden administration than previous ones, which is when they see this intelligence, they often will share it very quickly, essentially to try to deter, to tell Vladimir Putin or Iran, hey, we see exactly what you're doing. We know what you want to do, and our message to you is don't do it. The problem, of course, is when those countries, Iran, Russia, go ahead and actually do the thing, well, it makes that U.S. strategy look a little bit like it failed. I mean, there was a lot of effort around Ukraine designed to get Vladimir Putin to stop, to not go ahead with the invasion. Obviously, that failed. So I think in this case that we're still trying to get a picture of what the intelligence looked like, though they have assets that would be able to tell if Iran was readying those missiles. But I think it was essentially to tell Israel and Americans in the region and everybody else to be on high alert because this thing was coming soon.
Hey, Nick, for better or for worse, in the last 2 minutes, we live in a world where everything is political. What is the role, or what would be the role of a Harris administration versus a Trump administration with response to what's happening in the Middle East right now?
Well, I mean, it's a great question. There's still so much we don't know. I mean, I think largely a Harris administration would continue the Biden administration, so professing support for Israel, having Israel's back, but also looking to shape and de-escalate this conflict, and also putting some emphasis on Palestinian civilians and the high civilian death toll there, and the calls frequently for a ceasefire. President Trump has been much more unequivocal about his support for Israel, saying Israel needs to get the job done. However, on the other hand, he's also said, you know, if he had been in office, the war never would have happened in the first place. And he is also trying to reach out to Arab American voters because they're a voting bloc that he believes is largely split. So it's a tricky task for him. But I think, you know, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at least believes that Trump would be much more in his camp than Biden or Harris would be, and that he would get a lot more support. And certainly you saw that in the Trump administration the first time around. They were much more supportive of aggressive actions by Israel.
Hey, one last question, just got about 30, 40 seconds. Your best guess in terms of both the Russia-Ukraine war and the Middle East conflict that we are seeing, continuing to see, that it carries over into the next administration?
Oh, no question. I mean, the Ukraine war is essentially, according to military analysts, at a stalemate. So that is not going to go away. I mean, these are going to be the two top foreign policy priorities for whoever comes into the presidency. Big question is what they're going to do about it, and that's what we're all trying to find out.
All right, so appreciate you gave us a lot of information. Nick Wadham's amazing. He is Bloomberg News U.S. National Security Team Leader, joining us there from D.C. We know he and his team, super busy day, so appreciate being able to check in with him.
Hey, if you're J.D. Vance or Tim Walz, you got to be prepared for the first question.
Absolutely, right?
Given, I mean, what you were saying earlier too, just knowing the moderators and what they focus on, right?
Yeah, I mean, just check some of Margaret Brennan, her background, her studies, Middle East. She certainly, when she spent time here at Bloomberg, that was a focus, and her reporting was amazing. So you know it's going to be front and center, and we're going to be covering it here at Bloomberg Radio and Bloomberg TV. We'll have that debate. I'm Carol Master, along with Tim Stanovic. This is Bloomberg.
It's 3:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Stocks lower across the board. The Israeli military said Iran fired more than 100 ballistic missiles directly at the country. It is an escalation in the battle between the Middle Eastern rivals, fought mainly so far through proxies. A spokesman for the Israel Defense Forces says many of the missiles had been intercepted, but there were several hits in the south and central parts of the country. And in an update moments ago, the U.S. now says Iran's attack on Israel involved some 200 missiles. As I mentioned, stocks lower across the board. Let's head right over to the first word breaking news desk for today's afternoon call. Here he is, Bill Maloney.
And good afternoon, Charlie. That's right, U.S. stocks in the red, but well off their lows despite that Iranian missile attack on Israel. The Dow is currently down 90 points, was down 385. S&P's dropped 0.8%, and NASDAQ is lower by 256 points. The U.S. 10-year yield at 3.73%. Gold is up 30. Oil is also surging, but Bitcoin, that's lower by 3%. Among the main 11 S&P sectors, leaders were energy and utilities. Tech was under pressure, and leaders to the upside in the Dow, Travelers and Walmart, while Apple and Intel each fell 3% and led to the downside. After earnings, Paycheck rose 5%, and in deal news, Pepsi to buy Siete Foods for $1.2 billion. And wrapping things up, Nike reports after the bell. Live from the first breaking news desk, I'm Bill Maloney. Charlie?
Okay, we thank you very much, Bill Maloney. To hear live breaking news over your Bloomberg, type Squawk, SQUA, on your Bloomberg terminal. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
I'm driving in my car. I turn on the radio.
How about you let me drive?
Oh, no.
Who's gonna drive you home?
Honey, please, I'll do the driving.
Drive on.
Excuse me, I want to drive.
It's the question that drives us.
This is the Drive to the Close.
The funky music will drive us till the dawn.
On Bloomberg Radio.
All right, everybody, we've got just under 18 minutes left to go in today's trading session, bouncing around. Certainly markets reacting to the news out of the Middle East, but we've seen some recovery, certainly on the equity side of things. But we did see, for a while, a bit of a safe haven bid. So we did want to get to it with our next guest. Back with us is Doug Sioka.
Yeah, Doug, good to have you with us. Doug, CEO and executive partner at Kavar Capital Partners. They've got about $1.35 billion in assets under management, joining us once again from Leawood, Kansas. Doug, I thought today's market reaction was market's not closed, but has been really interesting given, as we heard from Bill Maloney and Carol just now, we're well off our lows of the session. Was it almost like investors anticipated a bigger escalation than what we saw from Iran, Doug?
Feasibly, Tim, I think that would not be a bad way to capture it, right? It's hard to put an economic calibration on the human and emotional toll, and it's incredibly sad, right, that the market has almost become conditioned to incorporating instances of armed conflict around the world, right? In many respects, it's found a way to manage through it, focusing more on the long term than the shorter term impacts. But like Charlie said, haven trades certainly still in effect, even though they're off their highs. Gold, defense stocks, oil bonds, Bitcoin seems to be sitting this one out. I'm not sure if that's a haven asset or not. The VIX got up to almost 21, now back to around 18 and a half. So, yeah, it's been kind of a boomerang session for sure.
And, I feel like in general, we tend to have a very reactive market, whether it's earnings news, whether it's Fed narrative, whether it's out of the Middle East. I'm not sure whether that's a more efficient market that reacts. And if things get bad again, things go down or things react. I don't know. How do you see it? And then how do you invest around it?
Yeah. So, Carol, it's interesting, right? We kind of look at the market as somewhat of an AI tool in and of itself, right? It kind of is its own iterative large language model, right? It incorporates the collective wisdom, emotion, intelligence of its participants, and it does it in real time, right? It modifies its valuation, its return stream, and it's why, in many respects, in my opinion, 10% drops right now get hit so hard, right, that within 2 years of them happening, this is fascinating, the market's higher 95% of the time. Within 5 years, it's higher 100% of the time going back to 2010. It's probably also why there are considerably fewer 20% drops in the last 30 years than in the 30 years prior to that. And also why bull markets tend to run well longer than they would in their historical averages, again, going back some, let's say, 30 years. Negative sentiment tends not to go as deep or run as long when there's better access to empirical and not just anecdotal information. It's reflected more readily in prices and valuation.
So good or bad?
I think it's great.
Yeah.
You know, and if you think about today, right, obviously the most important thing being this Iranian bombing of Israel, but you also have the port strike.
Yeah.
You also had yesterday a less than uber dovish Powell in his commentary down in Nave in Tennessee. You had a report about a production slowdown of iPhone 16s this morning. You have a vice presidential debate tonight. It's like a buffet of concerns culminating at a time when I think, right, yesterday we arguably had some quarter-end window dressing. We had the 44th all-time high in 2024. We have a lull before Q3 earnings reports. It's a pretty combustible environment, but it's not really resulting in much more than a small pullback because underlying conditions for optimism are really strong, right? Still dovish Fed, full or balanced employment picture, China stimulus, which is going to have far and wide positive ramifications, and lower inflation.
Okay, so you have something to say, Carol.
And yet, you know, initially, when Tim and I were prepping for our broadcast and our conversation with you, this was prior to the headlines and the activities out of the Middle East and the conflict escalating out of the Middle East. I had a lead into you that said B of A, Bank of America clients were big net sellers of U.S. equities last week.
It was a good lead, I thought, Carol.
After posting near record inflows over the prior period. Institutional clients selling for the first time in 2 weeks, hedge funds for the first time in 4 weeks, and retail investors for the third consecutive week. That was going to be my lead. So I'm just curious, are investors just banking profits at this point? Was it end of a quarter? End of a, you know, like what, I don't know. What are you seeing in terms of flows?
Well, we're seeing similar. I think that all of those things conspire to lead people to want to potentially move a little money off the table. Obviously, there's always something called into question about the sustainability of EPS growth. But EPS growth has been the fuel of the market's fire, right? And it has been not only dependable, but it's elevating. Right, from whatever 9% in 2024 going to 13% in 2025, 16% in 2026. If that all happens, right, now let's say that S&P just stays on trend and goes up 20% between now and the end of 2026, which takes to like 6,900. If we're at $320 a share, that's 21 times earnings. And guess what? Fed funds is going to be under 3%. So I don't really get the motivation to move a lot to the sidelines. I'll tell you what I found fascinating this morning by one of your colleagues, Alice or Elise Andres, who writes for the morning Bloomberg Live blog. She had the greatest encapsulation of what's happening. She said, U.S. stocks have the benefit of a Federal Reserve that's voluntarily and actively easing monetary policy. Voluntarily is critical because the data is irrefutable. If the Fed is cutting and the economy is not shrinking, meaning we don't go into recession, and the 7 of 7 times it's done so since 1970, 3, 6, and 12 months later, the S&P has been higher, and on average, 12 months later, over 16%. So that's a 100% hit rate, not a prediction, just perspective. And the economy is not slowing, right?
Wow. Yeah, no, that's a good point.
Well,
hey, go ahead.
Which maybe speaks to why Larry Fink doesn't necessarily think we need so many rate cuts. I mean, the question is too that, you know, Doug, and you probably heard it on Bloomberg, and we've only got about 25 seconds left, is then, okay, if things are so good, why did the Fed need to do a 0.5 point cut? Real quickly, your thoughts.
Yeah, and I agree with Larry Fink. I think the market is ahead of itself, and I think it likely will make a modification of that enthusiasm. But I think it was a pivot in the focus of the dual mandate. Inflation is under control. I think it's very dovish. They're willing to let PCE go at 2.3, 2.4 as opposed to 2.0.
Yeah.
But I think because of the focus on the job market, they're going to try this live experiment of being a little preemptive, cutting a little bit quickly early, and then making those decisions more on a data-dependent basis.
All right, got to run. Good to check in, as always. Doug Sioka, CEO, Executive Partner at Kavar Capital Partners, joining us from Leawood, Kansas. Folks, got about 10 minutes left in the trading day. This is Bloomberg.
listening to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Tim Stenivek on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
All right, everybody, just about 6-7 minutes to go until we head over to our TV colleagues, wrap up this trading day. An interesting one where we've seen markets move around a bit. We saw the VIX move up. Volatility, certainly once again in the markets, but it does feel like things have settled down a bit as things have settled down, at least for the moment. I use settle down. I don't know if that's the best word, but over in the Middle East.
Yeah, our top read story in the last hour, Carol, on the Bloomberg terminal is about Iran launching ballistic missiles at Israel as the U.S. vows to defend. We are going to continue to cover that in our 4 o'clock hour. A couple other stories that kind of got past my radar in the last hour that I wanted to bring up, though.
Yeah.
One is the second most read story. It's a Mark Gurman exclusive. Can you guess what it's about?
Apple?
Correct. What does she win?
She wins.
Does she win
I need a new iPhone.
An updated iPhone SE? Because that's what the story is about.
Tell me
Okay,
more. Because I do need a new iPhone.
Apple is preparing to announce a new low-end phone early next year alongside updated iPads. The company nearing production of an updated iPhone SE that will become its new entry-level model. That's according to people with knowledge of the matter.
I don't want an entry level.
V15.
I don't want an entry level. I want all the bells and whistles.
All
I want a
right.
big phone, bells and whistles.
This one's not for you. This is for my sister-in-law. This is the phone that she likes.
Oh, is
it's
it
sort
really?
of the smaller one.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's the smaller
Do
one.
they really take away all the bells and whistles? Or is it just
No,
size?
no, they don't take all the. This was like a. They started doing this more than a decade ago, and they were trying to make an iPhone that would work in the developed markets.
Yeah, in the emerging markets.
Yeah, in emerging markets. And what they used to consider, it was like that candy-colored iPhone that came out about a decade ago. There were like the cute yellow ones and stuff. My wife actually ended up getting one. She loved it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. This SE overhaul, though, it's the first
Did she
one
like it
since
because it was
2022.
tinier?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and it was all she needed at the time.
Yeah.
It's going to help Apple compete in the low-end smartphone market. It faces tough competition from Android devices, especially in China. The current model costs only $429. It's hundreds less than the standard iPhone.
Yeah, but more expensive than many of its rivals.
Yeah,
So,
good point.
I'm just
There's
talking
that,
about
right?
if you're trying to like tap into the emerging markets, right? You're looking for probably a pretty inexpensive phone. But nonetheless, it is hundreds less than the standard iPhone, as you said. Modernizing the SEC so it looks more like its higher-end siblings should help entice budget-minded shoppers and potentially win back market share lost to brands such as Huawei and Xiaomi. So
Potentially.
Yeah, stand by.
I've said this
To be
before, so
continued.
if I sound like a broken record, I apologize, but it's a very important point. It's easier in China to switch between iPhone and Android because so much of what you do on your phone is done through over-the-top messaging apps. They're not messaging apps like we have in the U.S.
So you can flip around from phone to phone?
You flip around from
Piece
phone to
of
phone.
cake.
Whereas here in the U.S., if you're part of the iOS ecosystem, you have those green bubbles.
Guilty as charged.
You used Find My Friends. You stalk your family members on that.
We do.
Yeah, then you're locked into that ecosystem. It's not as sticky.
So can I ask
in
you
China.
something? When
Please.
you have somebody, I mean, we have just our core. It's
Yeah.
my husband and my daughter. But like I
Do I
recently
have
had
them
some
here?
family members who I love and adore who were like, hey, let me,
Yeah, no.
And I was like, I didn't even respond.
It's
to
extremely
her.
generational. I have my immediate family. Are my brothers and sister are my
This
immediate
was a
family,
sibling.
right? Yeah. Did you say yes or no?
I didn't even respond.
So I have my family, my wife, of course, and then some friends who, like 7 or 8 years ago, forgot to
undo
it, and we were all at a wedding together in
And I just don't
California.
feel like talking to anybody, and then they're like,
Hopefully they're not listening,
we
but
know
I can
you're
follow.
home. We
I
know
can
you're
follow
home.
where they are, which is pretty great.
I don't know. It's just an interesting world.
Kind of creepy, right?
Sometimes I just don't want to be found.
Good luck. You don't live in that world. Good luck, Carol Masser.
I work on that. All right, everybody, we are counting down to the close. As we said, just under 3 minutes left in the trading day. A little levity on a day that has been very, very heavy, and it's played out to some extent in the financial markets, but we continue to track all of the headlines overseas. As we said, that missile attack, Iranian ballistic missiles, more than 100 in Israel. We're still finding out and assessing certainly the impact, but it sounds like we are far from over there.
Yeah, Israel still says that no known injuries, at least as a result of this missile attack.
All right, over to our TV colleagues. We're counting you down to the close on this Tuesday. The closing bell starting right now.
Maine, both companies reporting earnings after the bell. Full coverage coming up right now.
The Closing Bell, Bloomberg's comprehensive cross-platform coverage of the U.S. market close, starts right now.
And right now, we are 2 minutes away from the end of the trading day. Romaine Bostic alongside Scarlet Fu, taking you to the Closing Bell, a global simulcast. It starts right now. Carol Massar joining us in the radio booth alongside Tim Stenovic. Alex Steele still on assignment for today as we welcome our audiences across all of our Bloomberg platforms, including that partnership with YouTube. Right across the screen here on the first trading day of October, Carol, a lot of that has to do with two big developments. Of course, a port strike here in the U.S. and military conflict in the Middle East.
Yeah, absolutely. Trying to assess all of this domestically, geopolitically. Having said that, certainly the Middle East, we did see market reaction, whether it was in the energy markets or that safe haven trade. We've backed off a little bit off of it, but we did see also the VIX spike a bit, hitting 20 at one point. And you do wonder, you know, Tim, certainly investors thinking more volatility to come in this market.
Yeah, I do think it's notable that that stocks aren't actually lower right now. I mean, we were down as much as 1.4% on the S&P 500 earlier in the session. Maybe investors, I know it sounds kind of crass to say, but breathing a sigh of relief that the escalation coming from Iran wasn't more, Scarlett.
Well, it's still early days, of course. This was just the first day where there was an attack. But I should mention as well that given that investors seem to be in a bit of a wait-and-see mode, it's interesting that volume has not been off the daily average. It's only about 4% below the 20-day average. I was expecting to see a bigger drop-off given that people maybe wanted to wait until there was more clarity from what's going on geopolitically as well as from earnings.
Yeah, absolutely here. And we should just point out here, we did have some big moves in the commodity space. Of course, oil prices did spike, as did precious metals, including gold and silver, as people went into those safe havens. We also saw a lot of activity in grain prices, which could be affected by any sort of prolonged conflict there between Iran and Israel. Meanwhile, we get the equity market close here in the United States with red across the screen, though the good news is we are far from the lows of the day. A Dow Jones Industrial Average down 173 points or 0.4%. An S&P 500 that's going to close just above 5,700, down 54 points or 0.9%. A NASDAQ Composite down about 1.5%. And the Russell 2000 also moving lower here on the day by about the same percentage, about 33 points lower or 1.5%.
All right, so on this first trading day in the fourth quarter, let's take a little bit of a deeper dive into the S&P 500, those large caps, guys. As Romaine has been talking about, I mean, most names, you did see that risk-off trade, so 340 names in the S&P 500 to the downside, Scarlett, 162 to the upside, one unchanged.
Yeah, and to go along with all that red you see there among the major indexes, you look at the breakdown of the sectors within the S&P 500, and the worst performers so far in the fourth quarter, of course it is day one of the fourth quarter, are tech stocks, losing 2.7%. REITs off by 2/3 of 1%. Financials losing about 1/2 of 1%. In terms of gainers, energy stocks, clearly the outperformers here, up 2.25%. 21 out of 22 names gaining. Utilities, another safe haven kind of trade, up 0.8 of 1%. And communication services higher by 0.4 of 1%.
All right, a lot of red in that map. All right, let's get to some of the individual gainers. I'm going to start with, you guys have been talking about some of the sectors that were certainly impacted as a result of what was going on in the Middle East. Well, the military names, the defense contractors, among them Northrop Grumman and Lockheed Martin, among the top gainers in the S&P 500. So let's just pull it up. Northrop Grumman. Sorry, up about 3%, but it was as high as 5% in today's session, but still with a gain, as we said, of 3%. Moving on over to Lockheed Martin, that one also finishing off its highs of the day, but a gain of about 3.6%, and we did see some higher volume. Scarlett was talking a little bit more about volume, but we did see some higher volume on some of these names. All right, two, also APA Corporation. This one up almost 5% in today's trade. Total Energies and APA approved a $10.5 billion project to develop the first oil discoveries off of Suriname with a view to pumping crude as soon as 2028. So we saw investors moving into that one. Of course, watching the energy trade in general out of the Middle East news today. And then Paychex. This was the top gainer in both the S&P 500 NASDAQ 100, this one up almost 5%, up the most in about 1.5 years. The payroll and HR services company reported first quarter results that beat expectations and gave an outlook. And speaking of earnings, we've got some crossing the Bloomberg.
Well, actually, a change in management. This over at LPL Financial, only about a $17 billion market cap. This is the advisory and brokerage firm saying that they have terminated their CEO, Dan Arnold, and I'm just going to quote this, for violating LPL's commitment to a respectful workplace. He has also resigned from the board, and right now they have appointed Rich Steinmeier as interim CEO. We should point out that those shares, Tim, halted here in after-hours trading.
All right, thanks for that update, Romaine. I do want to get to the decliners that I had my eye on today. I do want to start with shares of Apple falling close to 3% today. Romaine, did you get that new iPhone yet?
Well, no, I have not, but I did check it as I check it every 10 minutes here.
Okay.
It has actually gotten through customs, so it is actually here on terra firma in the good old US.
Okay, tune in tomorrow. Tune in tomorrow.
Now,
the next update.
UPS, the ball's in your court. Get this thing to me.
For the next update of when and where is Romaine's.
Are you going to do an unboxing video?
Can you imagine how boring? No offense.
God, that would be so
The iPhone
incredible.
16. Wow. Okay.
Please do it.
Hey, actually, this is a good point. It kind of speaks to why Apple shares were lower today. Analysts and investors are continuing to track just how high demand is for the company's latest iPhone. Many are hoping will re-accelerate growth. Barclays wrote, though, that Apple may just have cut roughly 3 million units at a key semi-component in iPhones for the December quarter, which it confirmed would be the earliest build cut in recent history, if they were to confirm that. Excuse me. Separately, our own Mark Gurman reporting that Apple is preparing to announce a new low-end phone. It's the iPhone SE. Coming next year alongside upgraded iPads. It's codenamed V59. It'll become its new entry-level model, according to people familiar.
Why does it need to be codenamed? You just told me what it is.
Everything needs a code. Names are cool. I think that's what it is. You got to have a code name.
What's your code name?
It's a secret.
Clark Kent.
It's a secret.
Totally, Clark Kent.
All right, let's move on to CVS. Shares falling a little more than 5%.
See how he dodged that, Carol?
I've gotten that.
So you know he's really Clark Kent.
Halloween.
He's had that before. You can tell.
Our Bloomberg News team is reporting that shares of CVS reporting that the company is conducting a strategic review of options, including a possible breakup, according to a person familiar with the matter. CVS faces headwinds not just from its drugstore chain, but also its Aetna Health insurance arm. The company also said separately today that it plans to cut roughly 2,900 jobs to reduce costs. Shares falling down 2.13%. Also keep an eye on HPQ, down 3% today. That's HP Inc. A warning from Citi about a cautious view on PCs due to the impact of a weakened macro environment. Scarlett.
All right, let's get to some breaking news. We've got earnings out of Cal-Maine, the poultry producer, so they sell eggs, reporting earnings per share for the fiscal first quarter of $3.06. That misses the average analyst estimate by 30 cents. Net sales for the period was $785.9 million. That is higher than the consensus estimate, although we don't have a lot of estimates to really cull a median number from. But nevertheless, the consensus estimate is just over $700 million. So revenue outperforms expectations and EPS misses. The stock up right now almost 6% in after-hours trade.
Yeah, absolutely. Interesting, too, in the statement, they also talk about their exposure to Hurricane Helene. Of course, they have a lot of operations down in that region here, so they're not able to provide too much of a guidance here going forward, primarily based on that. Meanwhile, let's take a quick look at where U.S. Treasury yields ended the day, slightly lower on the day, part of that flight to safety. Of course, the bid that came in was largely centered around the heart, the benchmark, the 10-year yield there, down about 5 basis points, 3 to 4 basis points moves along the other parts of the curve.
All right. Listen, what a day. And I'm thinking, this is just a reminder. And I kept kind of quoting as we were doing our coverage here, and I'm assuming you guys did too, of what was going on in the Middle East, is go back to December of 2023. And when we talked with investors and market strategists about some of the things that were on their radar, one of the things that was a key concern was geopolitical risk.
Yeah.
And so what we are is in this environment, right, where we have to assess, where does this go next? How much longer does it go on? We were just talking with our Nick Wadhams, who covers national security here in the United States, saying that, these are both issues, whether it's Ukraine, Russia, and also the Middle East, that will carry over into the next presidency. So this is something that's going to linger for some time.
Yeah, I think in terms of timing, it does come, just over a month away from the presidential election here in the U.S. And what ends up happening would certainly depend, at least when it comes to U.S. involvement in these regions around the world, would be entirely dependent on who ends up winning the White House, Scarlett, in just over a month.
Let's not forget, too, that we're days away from the October 7th anniversary as well. And there's going to be lots of protests here in the U.S. and around the world. And a lot of people, a very emotionally trying time, too, as we look to see what else happens.
We get to this idea, though, too. I mean, you mentioned foreign policy, and we were speaking with Stephen Cook over at the Council of Foreign Relations, kind of talking about the lack of influence, at least in his view, that the U.S. has over Netanyahu and that administration. The idea that, Israel has made it clear what its plans are. It's made it clear that it's going to defend its borders and to keep its folks safe here. And I think that's where a lot of the concern is with investors right now, is that in order for them to carry through on that, this might have to be ratcheted up, and no one really knows where this is going to go right now.
Right. What does that escalation mean maybe for the U.S. in terms of military presence or boots on the ground? So certainly something that we'll continue to track. All right, guys, that's a wrap. Our cross-platform coverage, radio, TV, YouTube, Bloomberg Originals. We call it the closing bell. We will see you again, same time, same place tomorrow.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
It is Bloomberg Business Week. We continue our coverage of the latest out of the Middle East. Iran fired a round of ballistic missiles against Israel, its second direct attack this year, and a further escalation of tensions between the two countries. U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said some 200 missiles were fired by Tehran. Israel, for its part, said most missiles were intercepted, as happened in the first attack in April. Iranian state TV said its strikes targeted, quote, important security and military sites. For the latest, we go now to Bloomberg News reporter Dan Williams. He joins us on Zoom from Israel. Dan, really appreciate you staying up late for us. Also, we are grateful that you are safe after this barrage of ballistic missiles were launched by Tehran. What can you tell us about what the latest on the ground is?
Well, I have to say, it's been an extraordinary year, and this has been an extraordinary day within that extraordinary year. It began with a small-scale Israeli invasion of Lebanon and ended with a large-scale Iranian missile salvo against Israel. We're talking about 3 hours now after the event. As you noted, something in the order of 180 to 200 ballistic missiles fired over after Israel warned its people not to congregate in public, to stay close to bomb shelters, after the United States publicly announced that such an attack could be imminent. So this was telegraphed well enough for the Israelis to prepare. Nonetheless, it really did jar the country, much like it did 6 months ago on April 14th, the last time there was a similar such attack. And now Israel has openly said that it will retaliate, presumably it will retaliate more openly and at a greater scale than what we saw back in April, which was a small, unclaimed, almost tactical strike on a strategic radar deep within Iran. So I think everyone is waiting to see whether that happens immediately or whether Israel will focus on its most immediate interest, which is dislodging Hezbollah from southern Lebanon, hence the overnight incursions of Israeli ground forces to that territory.
I try to understand conflict here on this October 1st in 2024, Dan, and I guess because there often is, as you said, Israel warned its people to stay close to shelters. The U.S. had some warning ahead of this attack from Iran. I feel like that happens where there's warnings so that people, hopefully civilians, can get out of the way. And then there are surprise attacks. And I'm just trying to understand military the way forward, and how does this all come to an end ultimately, or do we just continue to see attacks back and forth where there are warnings, so hopefully civilians get out of the way so that it's maybe not as bad as everyone expected, or as not as bad as a surprise attack? Like, I'm just trying to understand like where this goes. Modern warfare, I guess.
War is about the infliction of pain, and the question is it inflicted in terms of the degrading of the fighting capabilities of one side, or is it inflicted in terms of the domestic morale, in terms of civilian casualties? This war has been extraordinary by any measure. It's been running almost a year now, as you noted. The first anniversary is coming up just a few days away. Israelis, in any event, are describing it as something akin to the war of Israel's creation in 1948. Really, that was a completely different situation in terms of the technologies available, the demography available. But nonetheless, I think that comparison conveys the sense this is an existential struggle. Israel is not a raid against Lebanon per se, or the Lebanese military. It's a raid against a Lebanese political party, a militia called Hezbollah, which is sponsored by a third country, Iran. And it's largely been portraying this as yet another proxy battle with Iran. It's actually been encouraged Lebanese civilians to get out of the way while it moves into southern Lebanon to what it says extricate what there is there of Hezbollah emplacements, weaponry, tunnels, which it hopes to destroy. So displaced Israelis from the north of the country can return home after more than a year. However, when Iran attacks Israel directly, as it did now openly, and it's worth noting that one of the reasons Iran gave was for the assassination just a few weeks ago of a Hamas leader in Tehran as he was being hosted by the Iranians. Israel never took credit for that, but it's widely suspected to have carried out that assassination. Nonetheless, when there is an open, blunt, large-scale attack such as this one on Israel, something in the order of, as we said, 200 ballistic missiles, that really changes the equation. And it appears that this may shift from being a proxy war to a direct confrontation between Israel and Iran. So the big question is, what will Israel do now? There's some speculation of strategic strikes on major Iranian facilities, perhaps support, perhaps military bases of the like. But I don't think this will pass without a significant Israeli response. And I think many Israelis are wondering whether the way to end this war, if it can be ended, is to take the war to the side which they see as being behind it, which is Iran, rather than continue to battle the Iranian proxies on its borders.
How based on your reporting, Dan, would Israel fare in a direct war against Iran?
That's an excellent question. Keep in mind there's a distance of something like 750 miles between them. They don't share a border. There are several countries in between them. Now, Israel has a very sophisticated advanced military, but it's a small country. It's a country the size of Wales or New Jersey, facing a country the size of France, which has a fairly antiquated military, but clearly much strategic depth in terms of geography. We've also seen that the Israelis, while very good at precision strikes, while very good at tactical stealth, maybe even strategic thinking, things can change very quickly if Israelis lose their citizens, their soldiers, their service members into captivity. We've seen the situation in Gaza being very complicated because there are some 100 hostages still there from October 7th. And if anything, Israel has more leeway in terms of planning in Lebanon because it does not have a hostage crisis or a captive crisis there. So, for example, assuming Israel were to carry out sustained airstrikes on Iran, there is a chance of pilots getting shot down, bailing out because of a malfunction. Some of them may actually be women. Those crews are mixed gender. How would Israelis then deal with a situation when a hardened enemy on the other side of the region holds their citizens as prisoners of war? There's much to factor in here. I'm not sure the Israelis are chomping at the bit to take the fight to Iran. However, there is exhaustion. There's real fatigue with this war going on several borders. It should be said, however, that it is, if you put aside the Iranian threat, the Iranian attack of today, Israel appears to be making progress when it comes to its fight against Hamas, when it's fight against Hezbollah. Some really, really significant gains in terms of degrading capabilities, taking over territory. Obviously, there's been major disruption and suffering when it comes to Palestinian civilians and Lebanese civilians. But nonetheless, it would appear that its war against the proxies has been scoring success in its own right. So perhaps Israel might not be impatient to take this war up with Iran directly.
Dan, real quickly, last question. So is the next 24, 48 hours, next week critical in kind of understanding what happens next?
That's anyone's guess. Israel's official line is that it will respond, but at a time, a place, and with a method of its choosing. It's going to take its time. It's going to consult with the Americans on this. I think it wants the Biden administration on side as it pursues these ground incursions into southern Lebanon that were opposed by the White House. So it may think it's worth pursuing that and waiting to choose a proper retaliation when the time comes. I think the fact that this did not cause major casualties in Israel. It did certainly jar people. It killed the Palestinian in the West Bank, but it did not cause major casualties. I think that will be taken aboard in the Israeli calculations as well.
So appreciate it. Stay safe. We do know it's late into the evening there in Israel. Bloomberg News reporter Dan Williams joining us once again with an update out of the Middle East.
Hey, I'm watching shares of Nike. They're higher right now, bouncing around a little, but by 2% right now. The company out with earnings and some news. The company did ever so slightly miss when it came to revenue for the most recent quarter. Revenue for the first quarter coming in at $11.59 billion, estimates for $11.65 billion. The company did postpone a previously announced investor day. The teams, according to the company, are energized as Elliott Hill returns. Carol, a reminder, he's set to return in just about 2 weeks, start on October 14th.
Yeah, someone who was at Nike back in 1988. He's now back as CEO. Let's get to it. Bloomberg Intelligence senior analyst for e-commerce, athleisure, off-price retail, Poonam Goyal. She's with us from our Chicago bureau. Poonam, I'm seeing the stock bounce around. It was up as much as 4%. It's now up about 1%. Walk us through what's important here.
Yeah, so the results largely came in line with expectations. They missed by a little, but we weren't expecting anything, so positive out of Nike so early on in the transition. What we think is important is that they postponed their investor meeting, which is supposed to happen in the third week of November. And that means that they're buying time. They're buying time to tell the story of how they're going to turn the business around in the next 12 to 18 to 24 months. So that's really key here. We want to kind of see on the call what type of message they're delivering on how they will approach, especially this coming fiscal year, and when Hill will be ready to address the investment community on his plans for a turnaround.
Okay, well, from your view, what should that plan include, Poonam? What does he need to do to turn around the company?
It goes back to the basics. It goes back to merchandising. It goes back to product. We need to see a better product pipeline. We can't just, put all eggs in one basket. It can't just be the Dunks. It can't be the Air Forces. It needs to be more than that. So what is that pipeline? How do they go back out there? How do they beat competition, especially in running and lifestyle, where they have given up a lion's share?
So is it a case of collaborations? Is it with, well-known athletes that does it? Is it a case of having people who really understand kind of fashionably what's going on in terms of trends? What is it that needs to go on in terms of the Nike team that they get it right? Because they're massive, right? I mean, everybody kind of watches what they do, but how do they get the trends or what consumers want right?
Yeah, so they definitely are massive. It's a $50 billion company on top line for the year. The thing here is that, when you think about who endorses them in basketball, they clearly have the largest and the biggest players. But when it comes to running and when it comes to lifestyle, I think they could push a little harder on getting the right people to endorse those categories, because marketing and product will both be key here to really reverse the psychology that's within the consumers that, do we want to wear Ons for running, or why do we want to wear Nike, right? You have to create that shift, and I think that will take marketing and product both, and you will need the right endorsers.
Just keeping an eye on shares as we continue to get an investor update, or how investors feel, I should say, about the numbers that came out. Down 1.3% right now, so they reversed that gain post-market. And now are lower. Hey, Poonam, I was interested to hear that Nike came out and said that teams are energized as Elliott Hill returns. Part of this has to do, obviously, with the turnaround plan that you talked about just now, and we'll learn more about at a certain point in the near future, I imagine. But I also wonder about the culture at the company, and from your perspective, what you want to see or what Nike should communicate to employees as it tries to turn itself around.
Sure. So, under Donahoe's leadership, clearly there was a lot of turnover, especially in the upper management roles. And I think with Hill taking over in the next few weeks, there may be a sense of return to the old culture, right, where he knows the DNA of the company. He's been there for a long time. He knows the organization. So I think that going back to its roots feeling has already come back in some way and will probably be communicated in a bigger way once he does return. The one thing I think, we didn't talk about that I think Nike did well this quarter is their gross margin line. They actually reported much better gross margins, and that's a good thing, right? Even as sales are dwindling, they're able to hold up their margin and even grow it.
So it doesn't look like we've got anything on Outlook, correct? And it looks like they're also going to outline their approach on the conference call. So give us some ideas of what you're going to be watching out for and kind of top-of-mind questions for the team in terms of how they kind of change the direction here for Nike.
Sure, two things. On the outlook, they'll be giving it on the call. So the estimate right now is for a high single-digit sales decline. We'll see what they say about that. But the more interesting thing is China. You know, China is clearly a big growth geography for Nike and even other athleisure companies. We've seen some struggles there. They did issue a warning last quarter that China is going to be slower. But what's interesting is the recent stimulus that just got injected into China. We want to see what Nike thinks about that and how that will affect the go-forward health of that country.
Yeah, I'm just going to say Greater China revenue, $1.67 billion for the first quarter, down 4% year over year. The estimate was for $1.62 billion.
Poonam, where do you think geographically Nike should focus its resources?
Well, North America, number one, right? It's its biggest region. But I think for growth, China still remains an important area where they should continue to invest.
Where does it face the most competition? I mean, we just spoke about, and these are completely different companies, although there is some overlap at the board level. But we're talking about Apple and what Apple's doing with the iPhone SE, trying to appeal to users in China to get them into the Apple ecosystem. They've been doing this for more than a decade. And now they face increased competition from Xiaomi and Samsung and other companies that are very prominent in China. I'm curious about like how the competition fares in China and how investors need to think about that market differently than other markets.
Well, China has competition not only from the local brands, but also from the global brands, right? So Adidas, Lululemon, Under Armour, they're all going into China. So I don't think it's, you know, that the local brands are more competitive than the international ones. I think there is growing competition, and especially the footwear, and more notably the active apparel space, because there you not only have the core athleisure brands focusing on it, but also the department stores, the mass merchants, just specialty retailers. Everyone's kind of encroaching on that category. So the competition is tough, but it's a market that's growing as people want to spend more time outdoors and playing sports, so that helps it.
Footwear versus apparel and the idea of the culture and Nike being cool. Like, help us understand if footwear leads the way or if Nike can pull this off from really focusing on apparel as well.
Footwear is its king. I mean, you know, footwear is everything for Nike. It is definitely the driving force behind the brand. It is where it stands out. It is where it has an edge still. I think apparel is a category that it does well in, but, you know, there's a lot of areas where the competition does equally well. So it's a harder category to make a bigger mark in from a performance standpoint for Nike. They're focusing on women's, which I think is the right thing to do, but so is everyone else.
All right, really appreciate it and all of the input here. Poonam, thank you so much. Poonam Goyal, she's Senior Analyst for E-commerce, Athleisure, and Off-Price Retail here at our Bloomberg Intelligence team. We'll look for her research certainly coming out on the Bloomberg later on and into tomorrow. Nike shares bouncing around. They were up as much as around 3-4%. They're now down about 1% here, Tim.
Okay, Carol, you know I was out in Colorado. I was biking last month with my dad. I went all over the state. I saw in some situations neighbors dueling with each other when it came to political signs. Across the street, next door, neighbors literally calling each other out depending on where I was a few times. It was kind of funny out there. But it reminded me of the deep divide that we see in the American political landscape. Not that I need to be reminded of it because out there in the media, it's there each and every day.
Right.
It's not just our imaginations, though. A report from the Pew Research Center this summer said, quote, Republicans and Democrats are more divided along ideological lines, and partisan antipathy is deeper and more extensive than at any point in the last 2 decades.
Well, we feel it, right? We talk about it constantly, this division that we're seeing, whether it's across party lines or elsewhere.
Oftentimes, folks out there use division and the word tribes to sort of describe division. It's often looked at in a pejorative way, just another thing that kind of pushes us apart and it makes us separate from one another. Yet Michael Morris argues in a new book that perhaps rather paradoxically, what keeps us apart can actually bring us closer together.
Kind of love that idea.
Michael Morris is professor of leadership at Columbia Business School. His new book is out today, Tribal: How the Cultural Instincts That Divide Us Can Help Bring Us Together. He joins us from New York.
Michael, so great to have you here with us, so relevant in terms of here we are in an election year. So talk to us a little bit about, first of all, that this just kind of general concept of what divides us can bring us together. Why did you think you needed to write this book and bring it to people?
Well, thank you for having me. This is a book that I've been working on for almost 10 years. I'm a behavioral scientist, a research psychologist, and my specialty is cultural psychology, which is the study of the cultural frames in our heads that guide our thinking, guide our actions and decisions, and what activates them and how they change. And I've been teaching at top business schools for decades, at Columbia Business School, formerly at Stanford Business School. So I've developed a toolkit for thinking about how to use the cultural forces that shape people's thinking to create unity in a group or to create change in a society or in an organization. And that's the reason that I started writing this book, sort of to create a playbook for activists, leaders, managers, high school teachers, coaches, anybody who has to orchestrate a group into, a productive direction.
Well, and what's interesting is you hear the word tribe or tribalism, and you might get a little, I don't know, maybe put off a little bit or think one way. But you say, when we think of tribes, it's countries, it's churches, it's political parties, it's companies, it could be families, right? Like it's groups that we deal with all the time.
Yeah, tribes, from an evolutionary standpoint or from a, classic anthropology standpoint, it just refers to the distinctively human form of social organization, which is large communities that are united by shared culture, as opposed to being united by blood relations or being united by, dyadic bonds between people. And that's how we differ from other primates. You could never have a chimpanzee Manhattan. Once they get more than 50 individuals in a group, it starts to break apart because they depend on either being related or having a direct personal bond of trust. We can trust total strangers because we share culture with them, so we can understand them and we can predict their movements and we can predict what they will do, so we can trust them. So yeah, tribalism is mostly a good thing. It's what made us human. It's what got us where we are. Now, I think what's really interesting is, over the past 10 years, while I've been writing this book, there's been kind of a trope of toxic tribalism that has emerged among the pundit class and has been picked up by politicians and business leaders. And the idea is that somehow a deeply evolved drive to hate each other has somehow reawakened, and now we're screwed because we don't talk to each other anymore, and there's no way to get the genie back into the bottle anymore. And this makes for colorful articles, and maybe it makes for riveting speeches, but it's a kind of despairing, fatalistic take on the conflicts of our time. I don't think it's a helpful way to think, and I don't think it's an accurate way to think. It's not a way of talking about tribal instincts that any evolutionary scholar or any behavioral scientist would recognize. So I think we've kind of talked ourselves into this take on tribalism that's not scientifically founded and not helpful.
Would you dispute the idea?
The purpose of the book is to try to debunk that way of thinking about tribalism.
Well, Professor Morris, would you dispute the idea that we're more divided now, like the Pew Research says, than we are, at least politically, and than we have been in previous decades for the last 20 years? Does that seem like it's not necessarily accurate to you?
Well, perhaps in the last 20 years, but certainly not the claim that I hear more often, which is that the American people have never been this divided. If you read history, in 1860, Abraham Lincoln became president. He had less than 40% of the popular vote. 7 states seceded before he was even inaugurated. The Civil War breaks out a few weeks afterwards. 4 more states secede. Now, that's a crisis.
That's divided.
That's a legitimacy crisis for a president, and that's a big rift to heal. But Lincoln was one of the leaders, and there are many throughout history, political and business leaders, who they had faith that the best way to heal a divide was tribal memory. It was appealing to our common ancestors, appealing to our common past. Lincoln had that famous, mysterious line in his first inauguration that the mystic chords of memory shall yet swell the chorus of the Union. What was he talking about? Well, he thought of himself as storyteller in chief, and he made all of these wonderful speeches like the Gettysburg Address that made reference to the sacrifices of our common ancestors and the common ideals that even people in the South were moved by that speech. One holiday we have coming up is Thanksgiving, and we often associate Thanksgiving with the Pilgrims, but it was really Abraham Lincoln who started Thanksgiving as a national holiday, and he did it because he thought that we needed a national ritual of gratitude and memory, and that more than anything else could bring people together. So we may think of nostalgia and sentimentality about the past as a silly, irrational way of thinking, but it's a deep part of our tribal wiring, and one that can be used for inclusiveness, not just for divisiveness. We see a brand of populist politics nowadays where the story is, things used to be great, but now we have all these immigrants and things are going to hell. Well, that's a divisive form of populism, but there have been many leaders who practiced inclusive forms of populism. And I think, we need to understand tribalism and understand all the ways that we can use it at a time like this.
Well, when we come back, we want to continue. We have to do a little bit of news, but we want to come back with you, Professor Morris, and continue this conversation. And because you've also advised political campaigns that we know, whether it was Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden, we want to dig a little bit more deeper into politics, but also maybe tools that we can all use so that when we have kind of the division aspect of our society out there, maybe how we can get to a better place that actually brings us together, what we can all do to get to that point.
Also, full disclosure, Professor Morris was my professor at business school. As I was doing research and saw his name for this segment, I was, oh yeah, my first class in business school.
We're gonna have
Professor
to find
Morris.
Out.
It's an intensive sort of social psychology class that you take, for 2.5 weeks? Is that right?
Professor
Roughly
Morris,
2.5
maybe
weeks?
you can go in your files and check out what grade Tim got. We can
grade non-disclosure is a great thing about business school.
Professor Morris, Michael Morris, Professor of Leadership at Columbia Business School. We're going to come back. We're talking about his book, Tribal, How the Cultural Instincts That Divide Us Can Help Bring Us Together. More to come on the other side.
It's 4:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. A day of fast-moving developments. The Israeli military said Iran fired more than 100 ballistic missiles directly at the country. It is an escalation in the battle between the Middle Eastern rivals, fought mainly so far through proxies. A spokesman for the Israel Defense Forces says many of the missiles were intercepted, but that there were several hits in the south and central parts of the country. After the bell, Nike reported quarterly sales that fell short of Wall Street's expectations, underscoring the challenge that incoming CEO Elliott Hill will face when he takes the reins later this month. We are awaiting the conference call, so what to expect? Poonam Goyal is a senior analyst with Bloomberg Intelligence. She was a guest moments ago right here on Bloomberg Business Week.
We want to kind of see on the call what type of message they're delivering on how they will approach, especially this coming fiscal year, and when Hill will be ready to address the investment community on his plans for a turnaround.
Poonam Goyal with Bloomberg Intelligence. Yes, we will keep you updated on anything that we learn from the conference call. The energy company EQT plans to cut its workforce by about 15%. LPL Financial says its board has terminated President and CEO Dan Arnold effective immediately for violating the company's commitment to a respectful workplace. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all slumped today. Did finish off session lows, but still a drop of 0.9% on the S&P to 5708. The Dow down 173, down 0.4. NASDAQ down 1.5%. 10-year 3.72%. The 2-year 3.60%. Gold up 1%, 26.61 the ounce, while West Texas Intermediate crude rallied 3.6%, 70.64 a barrel. Brent, the global benchmark, up 3.6% as well, 74.29. Bitcoin down 5.5% now, 60,284. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Carol Master along with Tim Stanovic. As we mentioned, we're talking with Michael Morris, professor of leadership at the Columbia Business School. We're talking about his new book, Tribal, how the cultural instincts that divide us can help bring us together. And at the beginning of the book, he notes that he has advised political campaigns about culture-relevant policies and messaging, and that included the presidential campaigns of Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, also Joe Biden, which made us want to ask him about kind of that political environment. We've talked about politics already a little bit, but I do wonder, I don't know, do campaigns want to hear about culture-relevant policies with everything that's going on? How do they think about messaging and getting to people who, in a world where it's like you're either in one camp or the other, and you don't necessarily want to hear about the other camp?
Well, I think, we're in for a treat tonight in this debate between two, very articulate, talented communicators. And I happen to be part of a team advising one of the sides of the debate. And I think that there are really important issues related to tribal identities that that the sides have to work on. For example, Kamala Harris is a person who has multiple social identities, and she's been sort of lambasted by Trump, I don't think very effectively, for claiming to be, both African American and South Asian American. I think that what she has to do and has to do well is code switching of, showing an African American audience that she understands them and that they can trust her, and showing a legal audience that she's as tough a prosecutor as any, and showing, other audiences that she connects with them. She has a Jewish husband. She was raised by a Indian American mother. So she's a person who can have a legitimate, authentic connection with a really broad swath of the society. Now, Tim Walz is a perfect complement to her. I've heard him described as an REI candidate. He's the only candidate who looks like he's actually been camping in his life. That you could go fishing with him and he would know, how to bait a hook. And I think he needs to leverage that. He needs to show people that he knows how to fix a car. He could help you, jump your battery on a cold winter night. He's that kind of guy, and there are relatively few of them in the elite levels of politics, and I think he has to show that to us. One of the things that's not talked about so much is that there's a huge gender discrepancy in support for the two sides. Young men are 12% less likely to support Harris-Walz than women, and among young men, it's even sharper. And it could really make a difference in some of the swing states like Arizona. So I think Tim has to, he has to step up and show that he's Coach Walz, and he can be kind of a man's man tonight in the way that. Sorry.
No, this is fascinating. I guess I want to ask you about what's going on in our culture, where so many younger white men are pretty angry and feel left behind. What's happened?
Well, they used to have a not automatic, but a relatively easy path to success and social standing because they were from the favored group, the group that was sort of the prototype of who should have positions of power and responsibility and affluence. And that is declining. It's certainly not over, but it's diminishing. And so they feel like people are cutting ahead in line. People are taking the places that should be theirs. And, it's not completely new. I mean, there's been resentments about affirmative action for decades, but I think now it's not just affirmative action. It's that we've had waves of very talented immigrants coming into the country, for the past 20 years. And that means that a lot of our, native-born white male good old boys are not, are not getting those promotions. It's Russians and, Brazilians and, Nigerians who are getting those promotions, and not necessarily because of any DEI policies, just because we have so many talented people from all around the world who've arrived.
Have you seen anecdotally that show up in your business school classes in the decades that you've been teaching? Have they become more diverse?
Very much so. The MBA population compared to when you were in it has changed dramatically.
Wow.
I had a class last spring, a class of 50 people, and I had 7 Nigerian students. Some of them Nigerian Americans, but they were all, students who were Nigerian, by identity. And that's, Nigeria is one of the most populous countries in the world, so we shouldn't be surprised. But it wasn't the case when you were in the business school classroom. We weren't recruiting from Africa and the African diaspora in the same way.
Hey,
and it's good for the world that we are.
Listen, we've just got about, Professor Morse, about a minute left. Your advice to folks where we see so much division, but you say in your book it can bring us together. What are tools we can do? Piece of advice. Again, we've only got about a minute left.
Well, what we need to do is understand what tribal psychology really is. And there are 3 parts to it, what I call the peer instinct, the hero instinct, and the ancestor instinct. The idea that we're driven to kind of imitate our peer group, we're driven to emulate our heroes, and we're driven to perpetuate the ways of our ancestors and maintain traditions. And all of those things can be positive forces for unity. And what we need to do is understand the levers for invoking these forces. They're inside every person, but there are triggers that bring them to the fore that are invisible to us because they operate unconsciously. And so I've tried to, explain what we've learned from lots of research about what those triggers are that a teacher or a manager or a politician can use. And then over the longer term, cultures are malleable, and we have to understand what are the signals that we can send to help evolve the culture. Culture is not a fixed thing that we're stuck with. It's something that we can mold.
That's a great way to wrap it up. Michael Morris, thank you so much, of Columbia Business School. His new book out today, Tribal: How the Cultural Instincts That Divide Us Can Help Bring Us Together. You're listening and watching Bloomberg Business Week.
This is Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
All right, everybody, you are listening and watching Bloomberg Business Week, getting ready to wrap up on a very busy Tuesday. As you know, our top story, Iran firing about 200 ballistic missiles at Israel today, a sharp but brief escalation between Middle Eastern adversaries that threatened to trigger a fresh round of attacks as Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu vowed to retaliate. So ahead of those attacks, Bloomberg opinion columnist Andreas Kluth wrote about how U.S. support for Israel cannot always stay ironclad.
With more on his perspective, let's go to Andreas, who covers U.S. diplomacy, national security, and geopolitics with our Bloomberg opinion team. Andreas, in your most recent column, you argue that U.S. support for Israel can't always stay ironclad, and you draw a historical parallel between what happened between Germany and Austria-Hungary in 1914. Take us back to that moment.
You want to hop straight back to that moment. What happened there is that in July 1914, there were many conflicts in Europe that seemed completely unconnected. For example, hostility between Serbia and Austria-Hungary, a naval race between Germany and Britain, and other crises. And through a series of steps that the leaders at the time hadn't foreseen, those suddenly within literally days and weeks became connected and became World War I. And there are parallels. And what happened in the case of 1914 is a Serbian killed the heir to the crown of Austria, and Austria wanted to retaliate. And Germany, which was the equivalent of the US in Europe, like the superpower, said, you have a blank check. We're behind you. Do whatever you want. Austria then took a risk it never would have taken otherwise and attacked Serbia, but Serbia was allied to Russia, so Russia mobilized. When the Germans saw Russia mobilizing, they got worried about France because Russia was allied to France. Then France mobilized, and then Germany decided it had to attack by going through neutral Belgium, and the Brits came in, and it was World War I. We have not that, I emphasize, but the risk of that, and if you're Jake Sullivan and Joe Biden or Kamala Harris, you're thinking, I have something in the South China Sea. I have something very dangerous in the Korean Peninsula, in the Taiwan Strait, and of course, Ukraine. Can these get connected? Because the Iran, North Korea, China, and Russia are increasingly behaving like an axis. So if the Israelis keep escalating, and each side said the other is escalating, and we always give them a blank check and says, we report you no matter what you do, even if you don't inform us. Is there a risk? That is, it's a risk, it's a scenario thinking that we slide into something bigger like a world war.
Right, World War III, which is something I feel like we started talking about a year ago, perhaps 2 years ago. Having said that, President Biden didn't speak earlier from the White House talking about really that relationship. As you talk about, Andreas, relationships, the President Biden, that is, stressing the relationship between the United States and Israel. Let's listen in.
At my direction, the United States military actively supported the defense of Israel, and we're still assessing the impact. But based on what we know now, the attack appears to have been defeated and ineffective. And this is testament to Israeli military capability and U.S. military. It's also a testament to intensive planning between the United States and Israel to anticipate and defend against the brazen attack we expected.
That again was President Biden earlier from the White House after the attack by Iran on Israel specifically. We're talking with Andreas Kluth. Andreas, you know, we have, Tim and I have certainly had a lot of conversations with various guests over the last couple of years about the possibility of a World War III. Safe to say, though, nobody wins in a World War III. And I do wonder whether that in some way, despite the alliances we continue to see being created around the world, ones that you maybe might have thought never would have existed a few years ago, does that alone keep us from entering and crossing that line into another massive world war?
We all hope that that's the case. But if just in 1914, there's a book called Sleepwalkers. They sleepwalked into it. They didn't say, "Oh, let's have World War I. That would be good. That would be fun." it happens sometimes. There are hidden automatic mechanisms that get you there. The war in Ukraine, where Vladimir Putin consistently and repeatedly and now again rattles his nuclear saber and gets weapons from Iran and supports Iran, and gets weapons from North Korea and supports North Korea, and gets dual-use equipment from China. There are these linkages. That's all I'm saying. And if you're Joe Biden, you have the responsibility for making sure it doesn't escalate. Now, I just want to make one thing clear. Today, it was Iran's turn for assassinations and other things that Israel did before to retaliate. I believe that they had in Iran, that the hardliners were afraid of looking weak, that the moderates would like to de-escalate, but had to do something, and that they did this knowing that the Israelis in Iron Dome would shoot most of the missiles down. And apparently they didn't even aim at civilian targets. To me, that's a sign that they're saying again, as in April, we'll call it quits for now. Don't hit us. What happens next is, and there is no question that America's support is ironclad in this defensive scenario. There is now talk is what will Netanyahu, who's for his own political purposes, on a escalatory spiral,
especially
will he strike Iran's nuclear facilities?
When it moves into an offensive side, you've got to watch in terms of the U.S. position. Andres, we do have to run. Thank you so much. That's going to do it for Tim and me. Have a safe evening. Balance of Power.
Politics to the world of business. This is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's New York studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
Iran fires more than 100 missiles at Israel in its second direct attack in 6 months, coming as Israeli forces launch a targeted ground incursion into Lebanon. We'll have much more with former U.S. Defense Secretary Leon Panetta.
The escalating conflict putting a spotlight on foreign policy on the night of the first and only vice presidential debate, with Senator J.D. Vance and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz set to share a stage just 4 hours from now.
We'll discuss the stakes for the running mates with our signature political panel. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano with us for the hour, along with Emily's List President Jessica Mackler, all ahead on the Tuesday edition of Balance of Power. A big night here, Kaylee, in New York City. The candidates are here, the running mates at least, for what could be the final debate of this cycle.
Yeah, this is the last one that is scheduled, as there will be no second debate to this point between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. And of course, as we've been leading up to tonight, the news has been dominated not by domestic politics, but by foreign affairs, with what's going on in the Middle East and Iran launching a long-expected retaliatory strike against Israel, though the strike was largely unsuccessful, with many of those 180 missiles that were sent being intercepted.
This is going to be part of the debate tonight. Surely it's part of the backdrop here as we talk about geopolitics, knowing as well that Kamala Harris spent a good part of her day in the Situation Room with President Biden monitoring this situation. We did hear from the president earlier.
At my direction, the United States military actively supported the defense of Israel, and we're still assessing the impact. But based on what we know now, the attack appears to have been defeated and ineffective.
Joining us now for more is Bloomberg's Nick Wadhams, who leads our U.S. national security coverage. So, Nick, we heard Israel and voices from the administration today warning of consequences. What's likely to happen next here?
Well, really what happens next is anybody's guess. We did see Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu saying essentially that if you attack us, we're going to attack you. So all eyes now on the expected Israeli response. We're going to be drawing a lot of comparisons to April after the Iranian strike you mentioned then. Israel responded in a very minimal and targeted way, and there was some indication we got of behind-the-scenes channeling between the U.S. and Israel, where the U.S. essentially persuaded Israel not to strike in a big way to avoid provoking even greater escalation in this conflict. But, you know, this time we do have indications, in part from the video footage you're seeing right there, that a lot of these missiles did get through. That's going to be very different from the April attack. So you can expect that the Israeli response will likely be even stronger than it was back then.
Indeed, the video that we're showing our TV audience shows missiles being intercepted over Jerusalem, over the skyline of Jerusalem on this first